They cut through my fence and stole my water, not borrowed it, not asked for it, not even bothered to pretend they'd try to talk it out. They just sliced the wire, dug the trench, and decided what was mine was theirs. And 4 months later, their shiny little housing dream was bankrupt. I bought 8 acres because I wanted quiet, that's it. A gravel road that turns to dust half a mile before my mailbox whined, arguing with the old pines, and a spring-fed pond that keeps my garden alive. My place isn't a postcard, it's work and habit and a small stubborn piece in that pond. It's the reason I plant tomatoes in July and expect them to make it through August. When they put up the signs, Cedar Ridge Preserve, Luxury Mountain Living, Private Roads, I didn't freak out. Development happens, right? I knew the pasture next door would someday turn into something with a gate and nicer mailboxes. The first time I met the project manager, he had a truck so clean you could eat dinner off the fender and boots that looked like they belonged in a showroom. He stuck out his hand, smiled, asked the usual neighbor questions about easements and access roads, and then, casual as a weather report, asked if I had a well. "No," I said. "Spring-fed pond." He nodded like he'd heard the most interesting thing. Construction started faster than I expected. Graders, concrete trucks, the kind of noise that drills into your evenings and makes you forget what quiet used to sound like. 3 months in, I went down to the pond with a bucket to check the pump line, and something was off. Rocks that normally sat half submerged were bare, the water line lower than it should be 6 inches, then another 6 2 weeks later. I went around the edge looking for leaks, animal burrows, anything. The dam was fine. The usual suspects weren't there. So I followed the spring, the trickle that feeds the pond, up the hill, the way I'd walked 100 times, and found a trench clean-cut, straight as a ruler, running under my barbed wire, which had been cut and twisted back like trash left out of convenience. New black poly pipe ran through it under my fence and disappeared into their sight. For a long second, I just stared. My phone was recording before I even thought about it. The pipe went 50 yards into the construction area and fed straight into a giant water tank beside their temporary concrete plant. Concrete takes a lot of water, apparently, and Bryce, that was his name, decided my spring was the easiest supply. He didn't knock, he didn't ask, he didn't even hide it properly. When I called him, he answered like it was a minor inconvenience, temporary connection, he said, until supply catches up. Temporary, until it didn't matter if he'd taken it without asking. Temporary until the water in my garden stopped doing what it usually did. There was a sound in his voice like somebody who thinks rules exist to be bent for people who can afford the bending. I drove straight into town to see my attorney, Daniel Reyes, because the knot in my stomach told me this was more than a jerk move. Daniel watched the video twice, jaw tightening, then asked, "How attached are you to that pond?" Not sentimental, he meant legal, because in our state, water law is a seniority game. First in time, first in right. The spring had registration older than some of the county roads. He pulled up surveys filings from the 1940s and said the words that made everything feel real. You hold senior rights on it. This was not just trespass. This was unauthorized diversion of a protected water source. Felony adjacent depending on how the state felt that week. We filed for an emergency injunction the same day. Watching paperwork get drafted that could ruin someone's project is a strange thing to sit with, precise, bureaucratic, slow enough to let you think, fast enough to matter. The next morning, a county truck drove down my gravel road, and a hydrologist from the state followed, clipboard in hand, and within minutes the flow meters told their story. 17,000 gallons siphoned off over 3 weeks. 17,000. Hearing it named like that turned the shrink of my shoreline into truckloads, into the difference between a garden that lives and one that dies in August. An officer walked straight onto the site, followed the trench, found the valve, and shut it off in a way that felt like a plumbing miracle. The hum of filling tanks stopped. The concrete plant went quiet. And for the first time that week, I breathed. Bryce tried the old excuses, supply chain delays, temporary necessity, but the county handed him a cease and desist, a temporary restraining order, and a list of potential penalties. You could see confidence leave his face the way a tide pulls away from the shore. Construction runs on schedule and schedules run on water. Without a cheap source, concrete can't be mixed at scale on site. Subcontractors don't pour foundations. Framers can't show up. The dominoes fell, the way dominoes always fall when money runs out of the plan. Delays, nervous investors, subcontractors whispering about timelines and payments. I won't pretend I felt no thrill at the sight of those idled trucks. But it wasn't joy I felt at first. It was a cautious, almost academic satisfaction, like watching physics happen. Later, I'd have to answer for that feeling to myself. Bryce came to my gate twice more. Once to tell me, with a man who thought he still carried charm, that I could have handled it differently. We would have compensated me, he said. He assumed I'd bend because it was convenient for him to think I would. The second time he came in a different car, older, his swagger gone, and said, "We're done. Company's dissolving." That day he asked if it had been worth it. I looked at my pond, at the repaired fence, at the slow, steady return of the water line. I could have taken a settlement when Daniel muted the call and looked at me like I owed him the decision, a check, a repaired fence, a confidential agreement, a quiet life. But if I'd taken it, what precedent would that set? If money means you can cut someone's land and call it temporary, then who protects the quiet guys down the road? The court case was not a TV courtroom drama. It smelled of coffee and old paper and felt like decency and legal doctrine wrestling in a small box. Daniel walked through the property records without theatrics. He let the documents speak. He played the video of the trench. The hydrologist explained how diverting that volume could damage downstream retention, that 3 weeks of siphoning during a sensitive cycle risks long-term change. Bryce's lawyer painted pressure and panic and investor timelines. Daniel answered with a simple truth: good faith sometimes starts with knocking on a door. The judge asked one direct question that I think broke the argument. "Did you seek permission?" "No, Your Honor," came the reply. There it was. The ruling favored me: full restitution for the diversion, environmental impact costs, repair for the trench and the fence, legal fees, and criminal fines from the state for unauthorized diversion. The numbers were substantial, not vindictive, but structured, so that the calculus that had let them cut my fence would ripple back at them. Investors pulled back insurance premiums, spiked contracts, evaporated. A few months later, the development group filed for bankruptcy. The half-built frame stood like a paused movie set, snow gathering where a roof should have been. When that headline showed up in a community board thread, someone tagged me with a smug emoji, and I'll admit I laughed a short surprise sound. But bankruptcy is not cinematic. It's paperwork and phone calls that go unanswered and trucks that no longer roll. Bryce eventually came by, and we stood in the cold and talked like two men who'd made different math and were living with it. He said under pressure they made choices. I said choices felt easier when you thought the quiet man wouldn't notice. He nodded. "Fair enough," he said. Then he walked away. Months later, a smaller company bought the parcel and came to the door with a folder and manners. Their manager said he wanted to understand neighboring rights before they moved a single shovel. I invited him for coffee. That's the ripple you don't talk about enough. Enforcement changes behavior. Not because someone wanted revenge, but because someone showed consequences are real. That's the sort of precedent that asks future project managers to knock, to negotiate, to pay, to treat land as something owned by people, not an abstract resource. Still, not everyone agreed with me. At the feed store, people muttered that I cost jobs, that I was anti-development, that I could have taken the check and moved on. Sometimes conversations pause when I walk into a place, and that stings more than court transcripts. I lie awake sometimes and wonder if I did the right thing, not legally but morally, because standing up can have collateral damage. A few families lost a timeline to a dream home because the project stalled. Subcontractors tightened their belts. If protecting what's yours causes others to suffer, am I the defender or the villain? Then I remember what the water meant to me. Not just irrigation, but continuity. The kind you feel in your fingertips when you plant something and watch it root. Out here, water isn't an abstraction. It's dirt under your nails and the difference between a harvest and an empty bed. If I'd taken the settlement, I would have fixed my fence, cashed a check, and kept my peace while a principle eroded in the sand. If I stayed silent, someone else would be next. Now the pond is back to its old self. Ducks in the morning, dragonflies at dusk. The kind of silence that feels earned because someone had to speak up. I read documents more carefully now. I don't assume a polite face equals respect. I don't let convenience be a cover for taking what's not yours. And yeah, I pay attention to the small things, the way a trench is dug, the way a pipe disappears under a fence. So here's what I want you to think about: is protecting what's yours always worth the collateral damage? If you were me at the end of a gravel road with a spring that your family has relied on for generations, would you take the settlement and move on? Or pick a fight that could stop a whole project and put people out of work? Drop your thoughts. Tell me where you land, because I want to hear it, not to be told I was right, but to understand how other people weigh quiet justice and the cost of standing up.